we now have our closing plenary, which will, I promise you, be very snappy, because we have this wonderful lineup of experts, and they have a very hard job. They have to give comments and a summary in 2 minutes only. So I'm going to begin with Orville, and then we go down. There won't be an opportunity for questions because we're summing up at this point. And then I have a small exercise I want to go through with you before calling on Heather McGregor to close the conference. So Orville?
All right, very quickly. I think for me, these 2 days, there are several takeaways. One is that at whatever proposition we find ourselves confronting, China is somehow at the center of it. At the same time, it seems to me there are two things that we've relied on over the past few decades that are now coming to an end. The first is the notion of engagement, that the liberal democratic world, United States probably paramount, that if we slowly interact with China culturally, commercially, academically, and through other ways, we would come closer together rather than farther apart. And I think we see with the advent of Xi Jinping that's ended. The second thing, which I think sadly is now approaching the end of its initial life form, is globalization. And the old presumption that the entire world would find it advantageous to come together into new global fabrics of trade, and that history was ineluctably moving on so that all countries would sooner or later become more open rather than less. That too is ending with the rise of a new kind of authoritarianism around the world. Finally, last thought. All of these contradictions and points of tension, and we haven't spoken about this at all, could be catalyzed with catastrophic effect by something busting loose in the South China Sea over the question of Taiwan, even Hong Kong, although that's a little harder to imagine. We could find these tensions erupting in a military form very easily.
Sobering, thank you. Anne.
Thank you, David. Is my mic on?
Yes.
Yeah, so actually I'd like to start off by really thanking David Teece for making this possible today. I think we all owe him a round of applause. I'd also like to emphasize how wonderful it is to see the diversity of viewpoints that we've seen in this room. Too often what happens is people speak to people like themselves, and there's no real debate or conversation. What's really wonderful here is that Orville, Schell, and I, for example, have completely different perspectives on what the causes of the problems are right now. Yet we're able to be in the same room and have a conversation together, and that really rarely happens. And again, I'd like to thank David for really making that kind of opportunity possible. I have three hopefully quick observations. The first one is it's so much easier to identify the problems than to suggest solutions. We've heard a lot about problems in the last 2 days. We haven't heard a lot about what the right solutions are. And I think that points to just how challenging it is. Orville said he had actually no idea what we should do, and we heard similar other sentiments echoed by other people. That's very scary because people like our president were very good identifying problems, the problems of increasing inequality, increasing lack of opportunity. And by identifying the problems but posing the incorrect solutions, we've actually come to a world which is much worse and much further from resolving these problems than we were before he was elected. And personally, I believe that much of the disengagement that's occurring is because of people like our president who are turning their back on global agreements such as the WTO and climate change agreements. In my own opinion, what should we do? And that's really the tough part. And I'm not really sure, but I know one thing for sure. I know that parents in China and America and presumably in Europe, they all want the same thing for their families. They want their children to have more opportunity than they had themselves. They want their children to grow up in a safe world where they can go to excellent schools, where they have access to health care, where they can breathe clean air. So we're really not very different from our global citizens in other parts of the world. And how do we achieve that? I really don't believe that we're going to achieve that by blaming the other side for our ills. We're going to achieve that by investing in education, by investing in reversing climate change, and by investing in our infrastructure. We're not going to solve the problem by essentially imposing tariffs on the other side. There are two areas. I have one thing left to say. I really believe that Adam Smith's insights continue to be very important. However, much can be said about where the invisible hand fails, and that's really absolutely critical. And the last 2 days, we actually achieved a consensus on where the invisible hand fails dramatically in two areas. One is in the area of competition. When there's not enough competition, bad things happen. And the other area where there's clearly a market failure is in the area of climate change, environmental degradation. So if I were to identify two areas where we should act, those would be them. One country that has not made it to our conversations, which really shocks me, is India. 20 years ago, I put all my other research aside and started working on three things: climate change, India, and China. And it's clear that those are the countries that matter. And it's interesting to contrast what India did with what China did. So I went to China in 1980. I went to India in 1985. And what India had done is they had actually tried to enhance competition through a policy called the MRTP Act, which unfortunately, instead of enhancing it, restricted it. If India had encouraged competition more, they would now be where, I believe, where China is today. China did something really smart. Despite all the aspects of the command economy, they had one thing right, which Adam Smith really emphasized, which is the power of competition. I have a piece of research where I talk about all the different interferences that China has done in the state, so-called industrial policy, where I show that the reason they were successful is because they encouraged competition both internally and on the world stage. And I think that that's really critical for going forward. Last thing, climate change. That is one area where it's really easy to see the market failure. You don't have to argue about it. And I really agree with everyone we've heard in the last 2 days in their emphasis on that is an area where we really do need global interference in order to reverse an incredible calamity.
I want to start with a quote from Adam Ferguson. "It is somewhat remarkable," he said, "that notwithstanding men value themselves so much on qualities of the mind, on parts, learning and wit, on courage, generosity and honor, those men are still supposed to be in the highest degree selfish or attentive to themselves." There's a tension that has played out in these couple of days between people who believe that the Scottish Enlightenment was in some way the origin of the modern model of rational economic man, selfish, individualistic, opportunistic. That is not true. And it seems to rest in large part on two quotations from Adam Smith, which are typically the only quotation parts of Adam Smith which the people who advocate this have read. One relates to the invisible hand, which has been mentioned, which is taken out of context. And the other is the statement that it is not from benevolence that we look to the butcher and the baker, etc. When Smith got up in the mornings, he did not put on his kilt, he did not go down to buy bread, Mrs. Smith, his mother, went to the baker and the butcher, and she bought bread and meat from a baker and butcher from whom she bought regularly and with whom she had built up a relationship, and between the two there was a relationship of trust. Markets do not operate in terms of homogeneous commodities and anonymous actors. And if you doubt that, the attempt to turn financial markets more and more into markets that could be traded by anonymous actors through securitization is part of the reasons why we're all in the mess which we are now in. We heard a little this morning about the need to align incentives. We've done a lot of trying to align incentives over the past century. The Soviet Union tried to align incentives. It had a very wide range of incentives. And it wasn't the case, I believe, that the Soviet Union didn't succeed because computers weren't quite powerful enough. And these mechanisms might succeed in future because they are. Making cars on a principal agent model worked for a bit, but in the end it turned out that people who made cars in different ways made better cars. The attempt to restructure management remuneration in line with a principal agent model, which gathered pace from the 1970s and 1980s, ended up not only not aligning incentives of managers with those of shareholders, but is today the principal cause of friction between managers and shareholders. Markets are social institutions, corporations are social institutions, and markets will only function well if they're embedded in the societies in which they operate. And corporations will only run well if the people who run corporations understand that these are social institutions, both in terms of the relationships within them, in terms of their many stakeholders, and in terms of the communities in which they operate. And I think that is the real lesson which we should relearn from the thinkers of the Scottish Enlightenment.
So I'd like to follow on from that. I think indeed that having this conference, having the spirit of Adam Smith hovering over us, is an invitation to go back and do exactly what the Enlightenment thinkers tried to do, which is to evolve a science of human interaction from the basic fundamentals of human psychology. And to put that in a very simplified way, it seems to me there are two really big stories that we should think about of what fundamental human proclivities push us to do. One of them has had a lot of attention, so I don't want to talk very much about it. It's the idea of competition. Human beings are naturally competitive. But the other is that human beings are also naturally and inevitably, if they want to survive, they have to be companionate, and they have to develop a spirit of compassion or of charity. And it's exactly that kind of framing that holds the charitable side, the compassionate side, the social side, and the competition together. If you don't have competition, you'll go into a world of complete inertia. If you don't have compassion, you'll go into a world that disintegrates. We were invited on this afternoon panel to think about solutions as well. So I think this basic psychological quest is an important part of looking for the solution. But we're also thinking, and that was the first direction that the discussion took us, about the big phenomena of the global order. And there, I think we really are in a very tense and difficult moment. I too am worried about the future of globalization. I wrote a book in 2001 called The End of Globalization, where I tried to show that this wasn't an inevitable process. But I think if you think of previous episodes when globalization disintegrated, it was so catastrophic and destructive that we really don't want to embark on that kind of course again. So what kind of course can we do to preserve the good sides of global interconnectedness? We don't have the kind of hegemonic presence. Many people in the discussions have referred to Robert Gilpin or Charles Kindleberger, who thought in terms of British hegemony replaced by US hegemony. We don't have that in the foreseeable future. But what we do have is a world of increasing complexity, but also of increasing data. And it's dishonesty with data that seems to me to be one of the fundamental ills in the world today. And a better world in which you can remedy some of those problems seems to be one in which international institutions really focus on the verification, the provision of quick, up-to-date, accurate data. That's important for assessing health reactions. It's important for assessing responses to climate change. It's also helpful for thinking about responses to economic challenges. And in fact, to economic policy challenges. If you can show very quickly what the results of trade wars are, you're less likely, I think, to want to embark on them. So my appeal at the end of this is a quite simple one. Let's get better data, and let's think of a way of providing it in a much more up-to-date fashion so that people can really talk about it and have an informed basis for decision-making.
Well, it's been a great pleasure and indeed an honor to participate in this event. I was thinking as I was wandering around Panmure House earlier today that it's a powerful symbol in its own right. A symbol of the smallness, the modesty, the bourgeois virtues that underpinned what we call the Enlightenment. It's in a way better than if there were a huge gilt-laden palace to commemorate Smith's contribution. I love the fact that in the House there's a letter in which Smith complains about what a bore the Duke of Buccleuch is, because there was an egalitarian quality to Scotland in the 18th century that has always appealed to me. It's there in Burns as well, even more strongly. The great ideas that Smith bequeathed us, not only the invisible hand, but this central notion of sympathy between us as individuals. These ideas sprang from something that was beautifully small and modest. The Enlightenment, at least the Scottish part of it, flourished in the most unlikely of soils. If you had spent any time in 17th century Scotland, you would have concluded that you were in some West European version of Afghanistan. In fact, I think 17th century Scotland was probably rather more unruly than modern-day Afghanistan. And yet out of it came this extraordinary intellectual miracle, related, but in a way that historians still struggle, I think, to understand, related to the Reformation, but clearly distinct from it. The second point I want to make is that this modest setting in this, by Asian standards, little town, barely a city from a Chinese vantage point, was always located globally in a network that crossed not only the Atlantic, but went around the world. It's amazing to reflect on how globalized Smith's world already was. And if you doubt it, I highly recommend my former student Tyler Goodspeed's excellent book, Legislating Instability, which shows how far Smith was influenced by the air bank crisis of 1772, an authentically global crisis that touched the economies of India and the American colonies, so close as they were then to declaring independence. So that's the second point to reflect on, that there is some interrelationship between the modesty of the setting, the smallness of Scotland, that miraculous little country, and this global network within which Smith could operate. In the book The Square and the Tower, I show that he was part of a global network of correspondence. Ideas were being shared in a way that didn't require the internet. Much of it was done by letter. The third point is that this global world, this networked world, had a kind of shape-shifting quality. It was in many ways independent of political structures. The political structures of that time were in flux. The British Empire, now gone, was already on the brink of crisis. The union between England and Scotland still felt new, was still controversial, had been contested as recently as 1745. Today, people fret a lot about the liberal international order, as if we daren't ever change the institutions of our time. But the liberal international order is a very recent confection. I'm not sure it really meaningfully predates the 1990s. And wherever one looks, whether it's at the European Union, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, the institutions are as much in flux today as they were in Smith's day, and that's okay. We shouldn't be wedded to any particular configuration of hardware. That was never the way that Western civilization functioned. I've noticed an inclination in this gathering, as in so many gatherings of academics, habitually to heap opprobrium on the president. It's the easiest thing in the world to get a cheap laugh from. But it's not accidental that Tyler Goodspeed, my most brilliant student, and certainly one of the greatest students of Smith's work in our time, is working on the Council of Economic Advisors today in Washington, D.C. for the Trump administration. I'm here to tell you it isn't all bad. It may, in fact, turn out on net to be good that finally an American leader has questioned whether we should simply acquiesce in the rise of China. Let me conclude, now that I've thoroughly shocked you and spoilt the afternoon, by urging you to understand the ideas of Smith as a software, as an operating system that runs independently of the political hardware, which is indeed subject to change and should be subject to change. What's beautiful about these ideas is that they are portable over time and space. And as I tried to argue in Civilization, they can work anywhere, regardless of a country's history, heritage, culture, religion, DNA. What is to be done was the question asked at the end of an earlier session, and we didn't really answer it. I think we need to teach the virtues of this operating system with its emphasis on individual liberty, economic, social, political, and its implicit preference for software over institutional hardware, because that hardware is bound to change over time. Let's teach those things. I don't believe there's an institution in the Western world that does a good job of teaching the ideas of Adam Smith. I work for one, the Hoover Institution, which is explicitly dedicated to the ideas of economic liberty, political liberty, and constitutional government. And yet the Stanford faculty around us appear to see these ideas as foreign to the modern university. I find that very odd, but I don't think it's unusual in academia today.
Thank you.
So the topic of the panel is reflections and actions. In these settings, it's a lot easier to reflect than it is to act. And so what I decided to do was to narrow my focus a little bit so that maybe some actions might be possible. I'd like to talk a little bit about corporate governance in this new Enlightenment. You know, there has been a consensus established probably since the early 1960s about how we should do corporate governance. The prior consensus is based on the assumption that a firm's only residual claimants are its shareholders, and that managers' responsibility is to maximize returns to shareholders. And the fundamental purpose of governance is to resolve a natural agency conflict that emerges between shareholders and managers, because managers want to do things that are inconsistent with shareholders' interests. And so we create the board of directors, and we create incentive systems, and we create all these things to try to bring managerial interest in line with the interests of shareholders. This approach to governance is deeply embedded in the theories in finance, the field of finance. But I think if there is an emerging consensus in this group with regard to governance, it is that there are negative externalities associated with a shareholder supremacy model. Short-termism, an inability to deal with negative externalities, climate change just being one example. Treating employees as interchangeable parts. These are all logical consequences of adopting the assumption, not strong enough, adopting the belief, no, adopting the faith that shareholder supremacy is the only appropriate reason to engage in corporate governance. If there is an emerging consensus here that has the potential of replacing that very strongly held faith system in finance, it is that, perhaps, stakeholders besides shareholders are important as well. And in fact, they may be important in a particular way that maybe is not fully appreciated. That is, if the only residual claimants are shareholders, then every other stakeholder, by definition, has to be a fixed claimant. And if you have resources that you control as a stakeholder that have the potential for generating an economic profit if used in a firm, why would you ever make those profit potential generating resources available through a fixed claims contract? There's no upside for you to do that. The long and short of that story is, if managers treat all their stakeholders besides shareholders as fixed claimants, they can't get access to the resources that are necessary for them to generate economic profits. There is, in fact, in the assumption that shareholders are the only residual claimants, a fundamental contradiction, because if that's true, then where do the profits come from? Where do the resources that are required to generate economic profits come from if you treat all your stakeholders as fixed claimants? So, what does that mean? It means we need to deal with managers in making decisions have to consider the interests of other stakeholders, not all stakeholders. I'm not sitting up here and say we have to satisfy all stakeholders, because that is impossible. Don't worry about that. But those stakeholders who provide resources that are important for generating economic profit. And so what implications that have? It means we can deal with short-termism. Vikram Melt's ideas here are, I think, really important. It's not hard. What we can do is we can say we're going to change the rules. And one of the rules we're going to change is we're going to restrict stock options for senior managers, which drives short-termism. We know that. Another rule we can change without much difficulty is we can restrict the size of stock buybacks. We restrict the size of dividends. They have to be less than earnings, because that's called a Ponzi scheme, if that's not the case. We can also restrict stock buybacks, which also tends to be a short-termism. We can make it easier for corporations to change their charters that say, we're interested in implementing or pursuing long-term wealth creation and long-term value creation for our shareholders. And we can do that in the charters, and thus shareholders can appropriate this. We can make it possible for our managers to deal with the negative externalities that affect those stakeholders that are essential for them as they try to generate economic profits. And most fundamentally, we can recognize that if is in fact human capital is one of the critical resources for generating economic profits in a firm, that our ability to treat our employees with dignity and respect, and to create a common sense of purpose and vision and commitment is not inconsistent with economic value creation, but is the core of economic value creation. I do not think these are hard things to do. We do not lack the intellectual capability. The question that we face is, do we have the political will? Thank you.
It seems to me that we're gathered here to celebrate the power of free market. I think the insights of Adam Smith have been proven correct by sufficient history behind us. And I feel very much privileged to be here to provide a perspective, because I'm probably the only one who have lived in, worked under, and suffered through a centrally planned economic system, which has proven to be a failure. And the perspective I would like to provide is, we actually spent a lot of time talking about China, the rise of China, the economic growth of China in the past 40 years. And I would like to say, as I did yesterday, that the economic success, as it were, in China is actually a vindication of free market, not a government control of resources. China developed by abandoning the centrally planned economic system, by embracing the market economy. But China still has a long way to go. And China has to engage in structural reforms of its economic system to further downsize its state-owned sector, to open up more. And that's the way for China to further develop. I think there are worrying signs that there are rollbacks and setbacks in China in that particular regard. Internally, that, of course, would check the economic growth. That is, if China does not continue with the march towards a free market economy. Externally, of course, I think there's an effort, calling it trade war or economic war, to check China's rise. And in my view, those efforts will not be successful. In fact, they probably will stimulate China's growth and rise if China does it right. That is, fixing its internal problems, marching forward in the direction of the market. If China doesn't do it, then, of course, China's growth will stop. If China continues with economic reforms in the direction of the market economy, given the size of this market, given the size of the population, given the basis which China has built in the past 40 years, I think the country will continue to rise, and no force inside or outside China will be able to stop it, provided that they move continuously in the direction that Adam Smith has pointed us to 250 years ago.
Thank you. So it's been an incredible privilege to have you all here for the last couple of days. When I took up my position of Dean of the Business School at Heriot University in 2016 and found a £3 million work in progress on the balance sheet and was told that it was a derelict house in the middle of Edinburgh, I did wonder what I had inherited and what was necessary to do to finish it and restore it as a suitable memory and legacy for Adam Smith. And I do not exaggerate when I say that I think he would be absolutely thrilled to see so many amazing people gathered together to discuss his thoughts and his work. And so I would just like to offer, and yes, like everybody else, another quote from him, because above all, Adam Smith was about scholarship. And he spent his whole life as a scholar, and we have restored the house for scholarship and to encourage the debate. He said that science is the great antidote to the poison of enthusiasm and superstition. And so for the future and for what are we going to do, actions are we going to take, I would like to encourage more work is done in proving that his thoughts and his theories can be applicable to the great challenges of the world today. Those of you who've been in panels with me over the last day also have heard me say that some of the problems, I believe, are about the problems of measurement. I think because the only thing that is measured on the whole is return on capital employed and return on investment, that is why we get people making short-term decisions. That is why we do not have the kind of resources for innovation. That is why we have extremes of inequality. I think if we were able to measure the things that we value, then that would be a completely different premise. And I would like to encourage more scholarship. So for action on our part at Heriot-Watt University, we will be working now, first of all, to establish and get funded an academic prize to support more work in this area and to encourage more scholars to come together in the name of Smith. And the other thing I would love to achieve as well is a chair in inclusive capitalism, which I think would be another focal point for him. And just as Adam Smith's ideas went out to the world 300 years ago nearly now, so you've all come to Edinburgh. And that's what we would like to continue to do. I'd also particularly like to thank David Teece for realizing this, for Adam Smith and for everybody.
Well, let me thank the panel for what was a superb summary, if we could have such a thing as a summary. I have two very small exercises for you to complete collectively if you so desire. And one of the participants, David Hulbert, has created a little matrix that I'd like to get a show of hands on. So if we could please have the slide put up with the choice matrix, which attempts to define how we see the problems. You may have to wait a second. There we go. So inasmuch as some people think that the problems are internal, some people think the problems are external, some people think they're severe, some not, just contemplate this for a moment, and I'd like to take a show of hands. You only get to vote once. And you'll notice, rather than liberal democracies, we've adopted Niall's term of rule of law democracies on the vertical. So we have a counter. Where is young Kieran Kay? His employment is not finished until he counts, but I'm about to ask a show of hands, and you get to choose 1, 2, 3, or 4. Kieran, are you? There he is in the back. And assisted by young Tennyson Teece in case there is a counting error.
There's a feeling on the panel that we want more options.
Sorry. You always want more time to speak too, but you don't always get it. So you don't have to vote, by the way. It's okay not to vote. So maybe I want to give you 15 seconds more. The worry quadrant is 4. The big worry quadrant is 4. They're all worries. David Hulbert, do you want to say anything about your matrix for clarification? If not, let's go ahead. Let's take a vote on cell 1. Do we have a show of hands for cell 1? Okay, do we have it, Tennyson? Hands down. Okay. Cell 2. Okay, hands down. Cell 3. Hands down. Cell 4. Hands down. Can we put up the tally, please? Oh, no, you don't get that choice. All right, well, we'll come back. We'll report to you shortly while that is being processed and presented. Let me move on to display on the screen, if the IT folks over there are cooperative. One additional item we'd like you to consider. As Heather mentioned, this is the beginning and not the end, not just of inquiry, but efforts to impact policy and efforts to move to decision making. And obviously without consulting you, but taking a sense of the room over lunch, the following was crafted. Let me just read it to you. The first declaration of Panmure House urges international leaders to base their policies and decision-making on a set of common principles, as espoused and formulated by Adam Smith, which cherish the required values of an ethically based liberal democratic system, by which we mean rule of law, of course, Niall, a moral commitment to the well-being of our communities, and a firm responsibility to protect economic, political, and social freedoms, use resources widely, avoid unintentional consequences, following Adam Smith's advice, follow the rule of law, favor markets and prices as guides to resource allocation, and have a long-term view of private and public investments to support inclusive economic growth and prosperity for all. I won't ask, okay. All right. I take that as at least modest acceptance, and on the way out, there is a version of not this is a version, there's a hard copy of the declaration. If you so desire, please sign it. The hope would be that if there are subsequent events, maybe biannual events, this will be in Heather's domain, one might try and tighten this language and become somewhat more definitive and action-oriented. But notwithstanding, I think there is some value, and I appreciate your support for this declaration, and I really do hope as many of you as possible are willing to sign it before you leave the room. So with that, Heather, is there anything else you wish to say?
Well, David, first of all, before I say just a final sentence or two, I would like to introduce the room to Dr. Caroline Howitt. Caroline is the program director at Panmure House. I hope many of you have met her during your visit with us. We are very fortunate to have had Caroline work with us. She was appointed as the program director of Panmure House earlier this year. For those of you who haven't met Caroline, you may not know that Caroline herself went from a glittering academic career at the University of Glasgow to Balliol College, Oxford, like Adam Smith, on the same scholarship that Adam Smith went. Caroline also went, the Snell Scholarship that was founded in the 1600s. It only goes to show the power of philanthropy. But Caroline has a bit of housekeeping, and then I would afterwards just like, if you don't mind, to say a couple of words.
Hi everyone. As we come to the end of this exceptional gathering, I'd just like to ask the speakers from the final panel to join me at the back of this room immediately at the close of this for a photograph with which I hope we can grace our newly renovated walls in Panmure House. And if I could also ask the following people to join us as well, that would be great. Lord Sainsbury, Gary Pisano, Jiro Nonaka, Richard Nelson, Ari Lewin, Peter Klein, Henry Chesborough, Franco Malerba, William Lazonic, and Sarah Williamson. Thank you.
Okay, I declare the conference closed.
Just to say that as was mentioned by my fellow Scot on the panel, or one of my fellow Scots, many of them here today on the panel, Panmure House itself is a powerful symbol in its own right. And it's not guilt-laden because I only had the colours to choose from that Adam Smith had. So I was only able to choose the colours that were available for him. And the stone that the staircase is made of was the stone that was quarried and was there in his day. And so it is a very powerful place. And it is a place that we hope will convene together people like you. And as Jay says, there's no shortage of intellectual capacity here and capability to come together. And we hope you will do that again. And I hope that we will be able to come back together maybe in a couple of years' time and review what has actually happened since then and how far forward we are going. Because whether you are a butcher or a brewer or a baker or an academic or a thought leader or a businessman or woman, we all have a debt to the legacy of Adam Smith. And we all have a responsibility to see that software and that operating system go out and help solve the big challenges of the world. Thank you for joining us, and thank you again to Professor David Teece.